the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. One particular mom was kind of frustrated one day about how her 4-year-old son Brian was getting dirty outside. I'm sure none of us can identify with anything like that, those of us who have kids. Well, finally, at wit's end, she finally said, Brian, I wish you would find some place that's cleaner to play. To which Brian, who was obviously a pretty sharp kid, said, if God didn't want us to play in the dirt, why do you make so much of it? Logic one cannot really argue with from a lot of levels there. We come to a passage in our gospel reading today where cleanliness was an issue of sorts, and how Jesus kind of cleaned out some thinking on that whole topic. You know, the past weeks we've been touching a lot on John chapter 6 and the whole bread of life passage, and to a certain degree, the things that we saw there that Jesus was really talking about, we continue to see coming to us in a very, very different way. And this gospel is a similar vein. It's not the outward practices or the religious rituals that are most meaningful in our relationship with God. Those rituals and practices are beneficial, for sure. They are intended to help us learn about God, brought into a relationship with God, but they are not the most important, the most crucial. If they preempt the personal, spiritual interaction with God that we are called to, really on a daily basis, if they preempt it, then they're actually detrimental and maybe not all that helpful. And so we come to this passage where the Pharisees and a group of scribes from Jerusalem came to Jesus, and they saw something. There was a particular ritual. They weren't in a formal worship setting or anything like that, but they were about ready to take part in a meal, and the disciples did not wash their hands in a ritual type of way before partaking in that food, and they were confused. And so they asked Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands? Why do they eat with defiled hands? That word defiled shows up numerous times in our passage today. It's a key word. And so they seek to get an answer. You know, that practice was really quite prevalent in the day. It was codified in the day of Jesus in the Talmud, and later on in from the oral tradition, the Mishnah in the 3rd century, it actually got written down. In the Mishnah, there was a whole section about cleanliness, and this part of it devoted to washing hands and things like that. I mean, it was really rather kind of extreme. By the way, does that notion of washing hands, does that remind anybody of anything that we maybe do here? I heard somebody say, What are you pointing to?
At the altar.
What happens?
You wash your hands before you celebrate the Eucharist.
Yeah. Anybody ever notice that? Yeah, I'm sure you all have. You ever wonder why we do that?
Because that goes back to the Old Testament, God's law.
Part of it. That's part of it. Part of it's more practical than that, but you're right. Those are some of the roots. You know, back in hundreds of years ago, when people brought their offerings to the priest, they might have picked out some from the barnyard that morning, you know. And so literally he would wash his hands before the communion. And now it takes on more of a symbolic nature. You will see some people, some priests, after they do that washing of hands, they will hold their fingers together or they will hold at least their thumb and forefinger together until they pass communion to you. That's the only time they will use their thumb and forefinger. And they'll use their other fingers maybe to turn pages or something like that. You'll watch and we'll do that. Because that washing is symbolic of how the hands are being prepared to do something that we consider quite holy, very, very holy. And so it's being prepared to move out of common use. That's really where that word defiled comes from, common use to sanctified use. And you'll see, I don't do this, I don't follow this practice, but you'll see some. And then after communion is distributed and they wash their fingers again, that's when they are I guess you could say, consecrated or prepared to go back to common use. Some symbolism, that just little things that make us stop to think. Well, it was something along those kinds of lines that the Pharisees were saying to Jesus, why aren't you doing this? This is part of our law. This is part of our tradition. This is part of who we are as a people. Why aren't you following those rules? Jesus had something to say about it, as we heard. Mark emphasizes, by the way, the things that he records here, verse 3, that this ritual tradition was really not about hygiene or anything like that, but it was going to be addressed because of the significance that the Pharisees and the scribes had put into it. And even in verse 5, this quote from the Pharisees and the scribes asked them, why do your disciples not walk, listen to this, according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Indicates the place of importance in their spirituality of these outward rituals. And so Jesus quotes from Isaiah. And he says, Isaiah did prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me. Listen to this part. Teaching as doctrines, meaning the doctrines of God, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. I bet that stung just a little bit when Jesus said that. It wasn't that literally Isaiah had this incident in mind, obviously. He wasn't thinking one day the Pharisees are going to be doing this sort of a thing. But just that the things that he saw of his day, people engaging in rituals, and he could tell their mind is as far away from God as it can get. They're going through the motions. That's what the word hypocrite means. You know, it comes from the drama. You remember the old symbols, the masks that actors would put on over their face. One was a smiley face and one was a frowny face. It comes from on the outward expression or outward visible thing, we see one thing, but on the inside is something very, very different. Very different. That's where the word hypocrite comes from. And so it wasn't that Isaiah said this was actually going to happen one day, but he's looking generally, and then Jesus remembered that passage and said, yeah, that applies here. It really does fit right here in this particular instant. Because it's at the heart where the true issues of life really reside. Jesus said they were hypocrites. They were play acting. They were playing the part, but not living the part. And in a way, he was saying to neglect true holiness into the center of who we are as people and to submit to man-made traditions is, in a way, it's idolatry. That word doesn't show up in the passage, but in a way, that's what it is. It's idolatry. It's like saying, God, this is the way you have to be. And so take it or leave it. Here I am. And God says, when we do that, I know what I'm going to do. I love you, but I'm going to leave it. And then in verses 8, and actually it goes on to 9, I didn't read it, it wasn't one of the assigned parting, but verse 8 and 9 talks about Jesus contrasting the commandment of God with the tradition of men. Verse 8 he says, you leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. In verse 9 he says, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. You know, traditions, we all have traditions. Don't we have traditions? I mean, we're in a liturgical church. We have traditions all over the place. What are those traditions meant to do? Well, you know, all these things. What are they meant to do?
Honor God.
Christ.
Yeah. They're supposed to draw us to God. They're supposed to in some way help us to understand God, to have God revealed to us. But you know, we can get so enamored with the traditions that becomes the crux. That becomes the important. And you know what happens? They become a way of getting around God. Instead of encountering God, they become a way of us getting around God and escaping away from God. And so Jesus kind of comes down on them. You know, these traditions, it's not that, and getting back to that word hypocrite and everything and playing the part, it's not that they knew that they were intentionally understanding, I know I'm not letting God into my heart, I'm going to work around Him, but they thought that just going through the motions is what it made them acceptable to God. And Jesus said, no, nothing could be farther from the truth. So as he goes on from there, he calls everybody. Verse 14 said he called the people to him. And again, and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand. He's telling us, we need to understand that, all of us, all down through the ages. This is not just for the scribes and the Pharisees, it's not just for the clergy, it's for everyone. Hear this and understand me. And then he addresses this defilement. I wonder if you noticed anything about what Jesus said about this defilement. I'm going to add one little verse that I didn't read. Again, it was not assigned, but let me read these three portions of verses. He said, the things that come out of a person are what defile him. In verse 20b, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. And then verse 23, all these things come from within, and they defile a person. I don't know if you noticed it 3 times there. He said it's what comes out. What comes out of a person is what defiles. In other words, he could have said, it's what's inside, it's what's in the heart that defiles. But he didn't say it that way, at least not here. He said it's what comes out that defiles. Now, to be sure, that doesn't excuse us from letting something live within us as long as we don't get it out. Let it out. You may remember what Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount. Let me read to you just a couple of verses from that in Matthew's Gospel, the 5th chapter. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then a few verses later, verse 28, speaking specifically about adultery, he says, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so we know that the presence of these things in the heart is something that needs to be dealt with. But in our passage from Mark, again, 3 times he said it's what comes out. What comes out that defiles us. Jesus is talking about the condition of the heart. You know, in the Jewish thinking, the heart really was the center of who the person was, the seat of all personality and all those. It's the center of being. The fullness represented the fullness of who they are. That's what it meant to talk about the heart in the Semitic idioms. Again, remembering from Isaiah, their hearts are far from me. And so he goes on to this list. And there's a list of 13, one of the longest lists Jesus gives us. A long list. I'm not going to hit on every one of them, but I am going to touch on just a few, because we do need to rid things from our heart, because if they're in the heart, they tend to find their way out, don't they? They do tend to find their way out. But I do believe Jesus also told us that actually it can do more damage when they do find their way out. You can figure that out. But anyway, this list starts with the term evil thoughts in a way that could be descriptive of everything that comes afterward. Everything arises from evil thoughts. But the next word or phrase is sexual immorality. You know that phrase, we get the word pornography from that. Porneia is the Greek word. Sexual immorality. It's a broader term than what's later in the list, adultery. Adultery is committing a sexual act when you're married with somebody that you're not married to, or maybe they're married, you're not married. Regardless, one of them or both of them are married, they're not married to each other, and they're committing a sexual act, but sexual immorality is much broader than that. Much broader. It encompasses a lot of things. I won't give you a list of those things, but I'll bet you can think of some of the things that would be on that list. He talks about theft. Didn't we just read something a little earlier? Thou shalt not steal. Yeah, one of the commandments. How about murder? Thou shalt not murder or kill. How about coveting? That's an interesting word. Another translation uses the term greed. But you know, that particular word is often associated, as it is here, with sexual sins. Interesting to think about greed in that kind of a commandment. Commandment. Didn't we just... the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or so forth and so on. It goes on again with another word, sensuality. Another translation uses the word lewdness. That suggests open and shameless immorality. Our culture moved much more to where, hey, it doesn't matter anymore. There's some things that we might hear about, some things that I'll bet you don't know that's happening right here in America. You would just be shocked to hear about. And it is happening in other parts of the world as well, but that's where sensuality, that word means open and just shameless immorality. Envy literally kind of means with an evil eye. It means with a sight, a view to wanting something that somebody else has. Stinginess, envious jealousy. And slander, that can include not just meaning slander against another person, but also speaking wrongly about God. About saying God is some way that really He's not. Maybe we don't know because we haven't been reading our Bible. In a way, that's slander. And that comes out of the heart. And lastly, that last word, foolishness. Every time I hear that word, I hear my father-in-law say he used to just say that in a funny way. I can't even begin to get to it, but whenever he would use it, he would just say foolishness, just plain foolishness. And usually he was pretty angry when he used that word. But at any rate, it's the stupidity of one who just lacks moral judgment. So what goes into a person in that sense does affect who or what they are, but not in the sense that the Pharisees and the scribes were talking about. That was just food. But the moral laws receive a significant new depth as Jesus reveals their original intention in terms more than an inner attitude rather than the outward standards. That leads me to just basically one last thing that I want to say about it, why I think that he, at least here, emphasized that which comes out defiles. It not only defiles us, but it defiles those who are around us. Because it teaches them that if we allow it to come out, and we allow it to come out in such a way that we're not really upset about that badness, then we're teaching others around us that badness is really, it's not so bad, it's okay. And what happens to society when that happens? Well, it's like cancer. It's like cancer that starts at one cell in the body. And slowly over time, the body gets sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker until it dies. It's kind of like, it's a principle of the rain falls on the just and the unjust type of thing. You know, when we follow God's laws, you know, I've told you this probably hundreds, thousands of times. You can't earn God's love by following His commandments, by being obedient. But there is still blessing that comes from obedience. There is. We are made right with God through faith, through the work of Christ on the cross, us receiving that work applied to us, asking God to fill us with His Spirit, asking God to draw us into that relationship. That's what saves. But even if that was absent in someone's life, and they lived out the commandments of God, still God's blessing would come upon them. They might be still lost for eternity because they would be trusting their working out of those commandments for their salvation. Okay, that's why there has to be that heartfelt conversion to Christ. As Jeremiah says, the circumcision of the heart, that's what draws us into, makes us have a relationship with God. But even if somebody didn't have that, and they lived out the commandments of God, they would still receive a lot of the blessings from God. And you know what? As that attitude is lived out in society, the society gets the blessings from God. Again, it's kind of like that principle, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. And so as we think about, as we look at society in general, maybe our country in particular, but again, Western civilization in general, as we have thrown out the commandments of God, again, they're not the means for us to be made right with God, but they are a means for God to reveal Himself. And I guess I could say that obedience brings blessing, and disobedience brings, well, discipline and punishment. Does that make sense? Have I? Some of you, I think, are following. I'm not so sure about some of it. It's by grace through faith that we're saved, and that's what Jesus is after. Don't worry about these outward rituals. However, at the same time, as we follow the commandments of God, it can be a means for us to receive blessing from Him, and the more of us that live out those commandments, then the society or the culture receives blessings from Him. But it's certainly got to get to the heart. God is most concerned about the heart and about relationships. And it gets back to that old symbolism of the cross. The biggest part of the cross, the most important part is the vertical, is our relationship with God. But then the way that relationship is manifest is by the way we relate to one another. And so, washing of hands ceremonially isn't all that important. But really, where is our heart with God? But Jesus asks us maybe this morning, and maybe even in James. Verse 25 kind of jumped out. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Where are we? Do we look at the law as something we have to do to be made right with God? If we are, we got to look back to the cross. It's the cross. But because we've come to Christ, because we've accepted His work on the cross for us, does that mean we can throw everything out? No. As we go, as the church goes, so goes the culture. May God have mercy on us, but also inspire us that we might share His love with everyone wherever we go, in every way we can. Father God, we thank You for today. Thank You for Your grace. Thank You for Your mercy. Thank You for Your providence. Thank You even for the traditions that we have, but Father, save us from ever putting them in the wrong place in our lives. Come and fill us again, Holy Spirit. Touch us to the very, very depths, deepest parts of our hearts. That this long list of 13 things that Jesus mentioned in this gospel passage would never, ever find any expression in any of us. May you build up your church. Your church would go forth into the world to share your loving and saving grace with everyone. Be glorified, Lord Christ. It's in your name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.